Welcome to Novara Live. Coming up tonight, Reform have pledged to deploy the Navy to prevent small boat crossings. Are we going to war with France? Of course, this is partly, I think, to distract from various scandals which Reform are currently embroiled in, but also it's one of the effects of the Ceuta migrant crisis. Very brief though it was, its effects continue to ripple throughout politics at home and abroad. And Burmese pro-democracy icon, or once icon, because I suppose she's fairly controversial nowadays, Aung San Suu Kyi has been seen in photographs for the first time in years since her detainment by the country's military junta. I'm Michael Walker, and given we have a complicated international story that we don't cover much on the show, and I have to admit I am in no way an expert on, I am relieved to have Barry Malone on the show, who is going to tell me all about Myanmar.
I'll do what I can. And by the way,
I have such faith.
If the UK goes to war with France, are you signing up?
No, I wouldn't sign up, but I would support our boys.
Okay, great.
But I'm not putting my own life on the line.
I like it.
No, I wouldn't. I think we'll do the whole international. Let's not have what should have happened before the First World War. We'll do that again.
Okay, good.
Yeah. If you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. You can also listen to the show on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And remember to like this video. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And don't forget to let us know what you think in the comments below. The vast majority of Moroccan migrants who broke into the Spanish exclave, Ceuta, may have now gone home. More on that later. But for now, the impact it's had on the politics of immigration across Europe are very much still with us, and that includes the UK.
Crossings is down by 50% this year compared with the same period in 2025. And the month we've just had, July, has been the lowest number for 6 years of people crossing. So clearly progress is being made, but we're not complacent, and it's why I am here. It's why I've come down on Sunday to see the team, to listen to what they think needs to be done, what further can be done. So we're just going to be relentless. People want to see this issue addressed. I heard that on the doorsteps in Makerfield, but we also need to build a system that offers safe routes for people as well, because that also takes away the selling point of the gangs. So on every level, we've got to come at this, but crucially, increasing the enforcement activity. So there's been a doubling of enforcement officers through the National Crime Agency on the UK side of the channel, and French specialist officers are now similarly doubled in number, working on the beaches over there. So a big ramping up of activity this summer. It's having results, but we are not complacent. Much more needs to be done.
That was Andy Burnham saying he is committed both to clamping down on unregulated channel crossings, as well as introducing more safe routes for migrants. I've seen a few people attack what Andy Burnham says, more of the same, still scaremongering. I actually think that clamping down on boat crossings while opening lots of safe routes is the correct position and a defensible one. We'll talk about that later. First off, though, let's go to a political party who don't think Burnham has gone nearly far enough and who have sensed an opportunity to distract from their various financing scandals.
So Operation Fortress will be a combined military operation. It will save lives. It will help the French in fulfilling their job of stopping the boats, and it will save a huge amount of money. We are very confident that our policy of securely picking people up and safely taking them back to France, we are entirely confident that that falls within other conventions of international law, and you'll see that argued clearly in this document. When you think about it, what is the Royal Navy for? If the Royal Navy is not there to protect this country from invasion, then frankly, I can't see what its purpose is.
So as you saw there, Nigel Farage was chosen today to announce his plans to send the Royal Navy into the Channel to turn back migrants in small boats, returning them to French shores. No lawyers have really sort of come forward to say that the document that Reform have released is watertight and this will all be legal. Much more concrete in terms of an issue with this plan is what it will mean for relations with France. They, of course, have not agreed to have migrants returned to their shores, let alone in British warships. Zia Youssef, so the party's Home Affairs spokesperson, preempted those questions in his statement.
Now, I know many in the media are clamouring to ask, what happens if the French don't agree and Royal Marines attempt to land people on a beach? Let me be crystal clear. A reform government will show unflinching resolve to ensure that people who set out from France to break into Britain go back to France. That is our policy, not a future negotiating position with the French government. What France gets to decide is how that happens. Now, look, we would far rather disembark people in port, walk people down a gangway, and hand them to the French authorities properly. That is more dignified, and it is what we will negotiate for. And keep in mind, the official position of the French government is that they do not want these boats leaving their shores in the first place. Tory and Labour governments have paid them, as Nigel said, £1 billion of British taxpayer money to stop the boats, ostensibly. Our military would, in fact, be helping them comply with the very agreements that they signed. But if the Élysée Palace refuses, make no mistake, His Majesty's Royal Marines will disembark them safely on the very shore they left that morning.
Barry, are we going to war with France?
I don't think so. How quick were Reform out of the gates with this stuff? They were so fast. It's almost impressive how cynical they are in trying to distract from, as you said, there are so many scandals that I can't even remember them all. Read France. I honestly think France is a bit of a smokescreen. I think that people on the right here, they love to have a bash at France, right? I mean, that goes back centuries for you guys. And it's easy to blame France for people crossing from France, but, nothing that the UK has kind of tried with, between the two governments has really worked. I mean, one in, one out, that policy of, you send somebody who's arrived illegally back and you take in somebody who has a legal right to come in. That hasn't worked because only 3.5% of the people who've arrived via small boats have gone back as part of one in, one out. So from the perspective of anyone who wants to reduce small boat crossings, one in, one out has failed. Then you have the money that's being given, right, by the UK to France to police the border. And I think the latest amount was £660 million or thereabouts over 3 years. I read an interesting thing today. Apparently, the UK is in the habit of paying late. So, yeah, I don't know if France charges interest on that, but yeah, apparently. But what do you expect from, genuinely, what do you expect from £662 million over 3 years? I mean, that's not enough for France to completely stop these crossings. What are they going to do? They're going to put a gendarme
on every beach.
On every beach. It's just not realistic. And so, again, I think that Reform and others can criticize France all they want, but France is not the answer. Whatever the answer lies here, and it lies in UK government policy.
Well, if you wanted to stop people dying in the Channel, then if France did just accept everyone back, that would stop it in a day, right? Reform have a point there.
But they can't do it.
Obviously, they need an incentive to do it, so Britain would have to give up something. But the one way to stop people coming over is to reduce the pull factor, which is
Britain
to say,
can give them the Isle of Man or something.
If you cross the Channel, you're not going to get asylum because you're going to go back. If the problem with this policy from Reform is they seem to think that they can do this without agreement from the French.
Yeah, but yeah. I mean, we're going to go into more detail, I think, on whatever policies could potentially solve this issue. But this reform idea is nonsense. I mean, you said that no lawyers have come forward to say that it's workable. I think there are lawyers already coming out saying it's absolutely not unworkable. And the French have already come out and rightly said, this would be a violation of our sovereignty, which of course it would be. It's what was Farage referring to today when he said we fully believe, we have it on good authority that this is... Where did he get that from? Who told him that?
So I suppose
it's a nonsense policy.
Well, the other sort of undercurrent here potentially is the possibility that Le Pen wins the next presidential election. And if Le Pen wins the next presidential election, then she might be quite open to doing a favor for reform. He's also saying this will benefit France in the sense that the people of France who live in sort of Dover or Dunkirk, they're all quite annoyed about this. And obviously, if you stop people trying to cross the channel, then there wouldn't be so many people camped out in places like Calais and Dunkirk. So that's his argument. And if Le Pen were in power, that probably would make a difference. What's then a bit strange, and I've seen some right-wing...
Sorry to interrupt you. Why is Le Pen going to say, yeah, send them back to us, given her policies?
Well, I suppose you could say that the cost is not, like, huge, because it will probably just stop people using France as a through route to some degree, right? Because those people, I don't know if they would just stay in France if they're stopped from going to Britain. It might be that they never go to France at all, or they try and get to Germany. Also, I just think that political allies do favors for each other. And also Le Pen is going to be, Le Pen is not going to care about human rights law, for example. So I think that the limiting factor here isn't so much human rights law, because I think Reform are just going to say we have parliamentary sovereignty. If we have to leave the EHRC, we'll leave the EHRC. But then if, a non-Le Pen government is in power in Paris, then I do think this is a non-starter. And if Le Pen is in power in Paris, then what the hell are the gunships doing? Because the worst way to try and get an agreement from a neighboring ally is to threaten them with your navy.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean. You're right. I don't see, there will be legal challenges. I think there would be legal challenges here, but I don't, I think you're probably right that those aren't insurmountable. The big, potentially insurmountable legal challenge is about one country dumping people onto the beach of another sovereign nation. That's where you get into breaches of international law. I don't know, man. Maybe you're right. If Le Pen comes into power, she'll take... But I just think it'd be really bad luck for her domestically. Here I come, the great anti-immigrant campaigner. Send them home, but Britain, you can bring a few
Well,
back.
she'd have to get some wins at the other side of the European border, right? So she'd be saying, if Italy returns everyone to Libya, then we'll let Britain return everyone to France, and then we'll just pay it back and just say the new vision of migration is you can't just cross borders, and we're happy to be honourable and reliable partners in this new reality.
There is this thing that Trump is doing that gets sort of actually very little reported, where they send people to third countries, and then those countries have the responsibility for deporting them back to their home countries. So this has mostly been happening in African nations, right? So for example, Eswatini has been receiving all of these deportees
From America,
deported under questionable legal circumstances, who are then flown to Eswatini, offloaded in Eswatini. And we're talking about people from Latin America here. And then they're held in detention in Eswatini. Eswatini puts them on planes and sends them back.
So is that just Rwanda? Is that Trump's Rwanda policy?
Kind of. And it's not just Eswatini. There are other countries who they're sending people to also, in order to then be deported, which, again, questionably legal to send them to the third party in the first place, but also gets around some other legal blocks when it comes to deporting them straight back to their home countries. So, I guess when very right-wing, anti-immigrant governments do get in power, there are all kinds of nefarious things that they could get up to in order to get people out of the country.
We'll come back to this and talk about it in, I suppose, more abstract terms in a moment. First of all, though, let's talk about the political context here. Because Reform's plans for Operation Fortress, as they're calling it, might be poorly thought through, but that's just a minor detail for a party desperate to get immigration back to the top of the political agenda. And polls show you why. So according to Ipsos, immigration is currently the top issue of the British electorate, ahead of the economy, the NHS and inflation. And it's been in that position for most of the past 2 years. Multiple scandals as well have meant that Reform have become somewhat sidetracked from talking about what many see as their strongest issue. So the Sunday Times this weekend reported that Nigel Farage struck a deal for his comeback as Reform leader long before the 2024 general election. Now, that might seem unremarkable. Oh, someone planned to enter into politics a little bit earlier than they let on. Andy Burnham's definitely done that. However, the relevance here is if it can be shown that Farage was planning to return to Parliament at the time when he accepted his £5 million donation from a Thailand-based crypto billionaire. Farage's defence for not registering that donation was that it was given when he wasn't involved in politics. This revelation, of course, puts that into doubt. If he'd already made some deal as to what would happen were he to become leader again, then accepts the donation, then that looks a bit dodgy, doesn't it? Today, it was also revealed that the Parliamentary Standards Watchdog is investigating Richard Tice over the possible failure, or over his possible failure to declare an interest before a parliamentary debate. This was his defence. So he said, contrary to garbage in the media, I am being investigated for standing against anti-Semitism. You could not make it up. Standards Commissioner is considering complaint by anti-Semitic, anti-Israel lobby group over whether I should have referenced my register of interests at the start of a debate on UK democracy and Israeli influence. The same anti-Israel group failed to notify Commissioner that Ayub Khan MP did not declare his substantial donation received from a pro-Palestine group. Funny that. Interestingly, I've read about this story from multiple angles. Seems like no one's really telling us who this group was, either who funded him or, who's made this complaint. I think if you're being funded by Israel and you're taking part in a debate about Israeli influence on British politics, you probably should declare it. I mean, obviously, I imagine he's not being funded explicitly by the Israeli state, but read between the lines. There's some sort of Israel lobby organisation here, isn't there? Of course, Reform's other big headache has been the rise of Restore. At the by-election for Greater Manchester Mayor, Restore got 9% of the vote compared to Reform's 21%. Now, that's not bad for a party made up principally of one man and a few social media accounts, right? So most people had written off Rupert Lowe. I had, frankly. But 9% in a mayoral race, not too shabby. Nigel Farage, for that reason, appears to be, well, actually, I should say Rupert Lowe sort of made the offer at first. So Lowe and Farage appear to be considering some kind of rapprochement. Lowe posted a 12-minute video on the weekend. We won't show you the whole thing. This was the core message.
So Nigel, my message is simple. If you are prepared to work together around serious policies, serious reform, and serious government, then so are we. Not because it's politically convenient for Restore Britain, not because it's personally easy. After the events of the last 18 months, I would certainly rather not be making this offer. But millions and millions of British people deserve a patriotic government that puts our national interest before any personal differences that you and I may have.
Had that strange piano music in the background for the full 12 minutes on loop. I don't recommend watching. I watched it on double speed because I wanted to work out what clip to show you, but I wouldn't recommend it as a viewing experience. Lowe has said a pact with Reform would require Farage to commit to deporting millions of illegal migrants and foreign nationals. He says foreign nationals who, I think in social housing, a couple other things, if they're any of those things, they'll get deported. He also wants to ban halal and kosher meat, incredibly extreme, along with banning the burqa. He also wants to ban public Islamic prayer, and he wants a referendum on reintroducing the death penalty. This is all, apparently, though, an offer that Farage is at least willing to consider.
If it was the offer of a deal, it came in a very unusual way. I have responded to it, potentially, with an open mind, as I would, but I'm certainly not going to be ditching people that I view to be allies and a great asset.
So that was a reference to Lowe's demand that Farage drop former Tory politicians from the party's front bench. So sort of saying, would you make a deal with Rupert Lowe? Farage is saying, yeah, but, I'm still loyal to Robert Jenrick and Suella Braverman. Now, I personally thought that demand from Rupert Lowe was the least controversial. So, if Nigel Farage said, maybe I'll drop Braverman or Jenrick, but I do think we shouldn't ban halal or kosher, I would maybe have a little bit more respect from him. Because, of course, all of this crazy extreme stuff we'll do, but, Jenrick, he's my buddy, he's staying.
Yeah, but he wouldn't have much of a party left.
That's true.
That's the thing. I don't know, this is weird. I think that what we've seen in recent weeks is Reform they've been flailing. I think it's the first time that we've seen a weakness in Reform in the last couple of years, and that's been reflected in the polls. You know, I think that there have been several people who said, wow, it looks like Reform peaked. You know, maybe they've already peaked. And, you know, Farage is holding his absurd, self-serving by-election in Clacton. I don't think that's gone down well. I don't think that's gone down well with anyone. I don't think even Reform supporters really get that or really enjoy it or are amused by it or find it righteous or see it the way he has sold it as this standing up against the establishment thing. And then you have scandal after scandal after scandal. And genuinely, I cannot remember them all because one just melds into the next one. And I do think finally that's breaking through with the public. And I do think breaking through with, like, let's say, not Reform diehards, but kind of like the Reform curious electorate. We even have now open season, apparently, from the right-wing media. You know, I don't know what email was sent around, but now the right-wing media have been going after Farage. But a great gift he's got recently, which is Ceuta. You know, all of a sudden he has this little gift and everybody, you know, is allowing Reform to frame the conversation again. So look, does he need Restore is what I'm coming to. I would contend absolutely not. Right? We know that Restore has been trying to eat Reform's lunch in some places and has eaten their lunch a little in some places. But are they a real party? You know, in any like.
What if you can get 9% in a by-election? I mean, that's
how many candidates could they get out? Do you think?
Yeah, how many? Yeah, I suppose they've got an issue with how many candidates. They have. I mean, Reform already have an issue with how many candidates, but all they have to do is split the vote in some key seats. And I do think this is going to be a big story in British politics for good or for bad over the next couple of years. And I have to say also, I didn't see it coming because I just thought Rupert Lowe's just a Twitter account. I thought we've seen this story before where someone gets famous on social media and thinks they can translate it into electoral politics, but actually not enough people are online. It turns out a lot of people are online.
Yeah, you're right. That is pretty crazy, I guess.
And he is a real sort of factor in a lot of these races.
But do you think going? So if Reform are threatened now, they think threatened, and as you say, 9% not to be sniffed at. So I think we can conclude that they are threatened. But do you think that the right response to that threat is to go into a pact with them, given how kooky and extreme a lot of their policies are, especially when we know that Reform is essentially, I think, a one policy party, which is anti-immigration. But they need a broader constituency in order to do really well electorally. And don't you think Restore might be a step too far and therefore, Restore might be a step too far and therefore a pact is not the right way to deal with Restore?
Well, 100%. I mean, this is the bind they're in, right?
Yeah.
Because, me and Aaron were talking about this last week and saying they are sounding wackier and wackier. And the reason is because they're now competing with Restore. Before, they were really angling for, pissed off Conservative voters who might have thought they were a bit too far right, but sort of try and reassure them that, yeah, you're different, but you're not racist. You're sort of, you've got lots of non-white people in the front of your party and all of that. And hopefully that will make them seem a little bit less scary, like a kind of detoxification kind of program. But they can't afford to lose this 9% of people. And obviously that's just in one election, not across the country, but Restore do okay across the country. So now they're having to tack right. And I'm sure that's going to lose them a lot of voters at the centre. And so for someone who doesn't want the far right to get into power in Britain, is almost a gamble, right? Well, it's not a gamble because I don't have any agency over it, but there's two sides to this, which is one, I think the existence of Restore makes it less likely that Reform will enter government, but the existence of Restore means that if Reform do enter government, they're going to be much scarier than they otherwise would. And they'd already be quite scary.
And the electorate will notice. It's always been a thing, hasn't it, for the British far right? It's like, how far do you push it in order to be electable? And we saw, and what they would always do before is they would hide their more extreme policies, right? So if you look back to the days of, say, the BNP, everybody was always trying to out the BNP. I don't know if you remember, there was this amazing documentary years and years ago where they went undercover and exposed a guy called Mark Collett, who at the time was the leader of the BNP youth wing. And he was, considered to be this polished performer, this new breed of BNP politician. And Channel 4 went undercover and hung out with him. And then finally, he came out and started saying that he supported the Nazis and stuff, and they had him banged to rights. Still operates in the UK far right, but you know, he's a sort of a more obscure figure these
I
days.
think Rupert Lowe he wasn't kicking out neo-Nazis from his party.
But that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that like back in the day, they used to try and hide all of this because they knew that they had to hide it in order to be electable. I think we're now in a place where people on the right are a little bit more forthright on their views, but they can still be hurt by things like that coming out. And with Restore, like, it's already all out there, you know? So like the argument is that for me that if Reform do go into a pact with Restore, they've gone too far.
Yeah, as well, that's what it reminds me of is in 2016 when there were, you know, it got reported after the election, after Trump won it, that there had been Democratic operatives who were sort of really keen on Trump winning the Republican primary because they thought, well, if Trump wins the primary, then Hillary Clinton's going to win the election. So again, it was that same, you know, if Trump is the candidate, then it makes it less likely the Republicans will win. But if the Republicans do win, it will be scarier. And so they took the gamble, right? And I worry about this idea that, oh, thank God Restore are here because they make Reform less competitive. But, you know, if Labour collapses, if, you know, there's an election in the middle of the summer and small boats are still a massive issue, because I suppose also that's why Reform are talking about like issues, because they think if we can persuade these sort of right-wing Restore curious people that we're the only people who can stop the boats, then maybe we can get them to think, okay, I'll hold my tongue and vote Nigel Farage, even though he has some brown people on his front bench. Because that's literally what all the Restore people, whenever Zia Yusuf, unpleasant man as he is, releases a video, they're all responding underneath it saying, well, you're not even British.
Right.
And they do that to Layla Cunningham as well, who's, I'm not sure what religious background Zia Yusuf is of actually, but I'm pretty sure Layla Cunningham is Muslim. So, you know, obviously they want to ban halal meat, or Restore do. Reform has a lot of Muslim senior members. So, scary stuff. Let's hope it brings down Reform and not just ends us up having an even crazier right-wing government than we otherwise would do. I said we'd end on the more abstract issue of stopping boats. I think it was stupid to have that as a slogan, given that there wasn't a plan to actually do it. So I think having the Tories say, stop the boats and not doing it, Labour, stop the boats and not doing it, very toxic for British politics. However, this might be controversial. I do think that if we could, it would be good to have a way of stopping the boats so that we could then open safe routes. And lots of people say, why can't you do both? Well, if you open safe routes, it's not going to stop the boats. And then I think it's going to be really difficult for consent to be maintained. I think you can kind of only do one if you do the other. I think it can be very difficult to introduce safe routes if you've still got tens of thousands of people crossing the channel. And there is an example of this. So obviously what we're going to talk about is that the way Australia achieved this involved lots of human rights abuses. But the outcome, I think, has been sort of hard to criticize in a way. So this is from a magazine called Works in Progress, summarising the outcome of Australia's turn-back policy. The author writes this, Amelia Wood. On net, Australia's turn-back policy has made its waters much, much safer than they were. Between 2008 and 2013, when turnbacks were not in force, over 1,200 people drowned attempting to reach the Australian shore. Yet no one is believed to have drowned in the years after turnbacks were reintroduced. By ensuring those attempting the crossing would have no chance of reaching Australia, Australia removed the incentive people had to risk their lives, and people smugglers lost the market for their unsafe boats. In the meantime, Australian hostility to asylum seekers has softened. In 2010, 78% of Australians told the Lowy Institute they were concerned or very concerned about unauthorised asylum seekers coming to Australia by boat. By 2022, the proportion of Australians who thought boat turnbacks and asylum seekers in general were an important issue had halved. Asked by Ipsos last year whether refugees make a positive contribution to their country, 57% of Australians agreed, 17 percentage points higher than the average in European countries surveyed. 3 in 4 supported the global right to asylum, more than any European country except Sweden and the Netherlands. 3 times as many people applied for asylum in Australia in 2023 as did in 2013, at the height of the boat wave, to little public outcry. And at 120 claims per 100,000 people in 2023, Australia has become more welcoming to asylum seekers than the famously welcoming Scandinavian countries. Not included there, but which I think is interesting, is that on a per capita basis, Australia is the second most generous country in the world when it comes to offshore resettlement, which is basically what we mean by safe route. So they say to the UN, we're willing to take 15,000 people, find us some candidates from your refugee camps around the world. Canada is first, for what it's worth. Now, obviously, Canada doesn't have many unauthorized entries for a different reason, which is they don't have any neighbors other than the United States. Barry, what do you make of that example?
First, just a side point. The Scandinavian countries, I don't know when that piece was written, but the Scandinavian countries are not friendly anymore. They have been captured by right-wing
But she'd argue that was
sentiment.
Partly because the manner of asylum migration gave those parties a boost, right?
Okay.
So the argument is precisely that, because Australia has had managed asylum as opposed to unmanaged asylum, that has maintained support for a more progressive asylum policy than has been able to be maintained in the Scandi countries. Because obviously the Scandi countries have massively turned against migration. But the argument here would be that that's because it was unmanaged, unregulated migration.
I think partly that the sentiment has become less negative and less hostile because it's not being whipped up as much anymore, because, you know, the punitive policies came in and the right wing won out. And so therefore they're not out there like, you know, like Reform are here whipping everybody up. I think, before I get into the Australia policy, the other point that I just want to make about this is I resent the fact that this is leading the agenda today. I genuinely resent the fact, because I think that Reform have been opportunistic here, where they've taken this issue that happened in Ceuta, and they've weaponized it, which is not surprising, right? They always do that. But as was explained earlier, and as it was explained on Novara on Friday and in the media last week and over the weekend, almost all of these people went back to Morocco. Nobody crossed to Spain. You know, I think to take this and extrapolate it into an invasion of Europe and something that has any real material impact on the UK is nonsense. I know you agree with that. It's just something that's been weaponized. So what happens is Reform come out, they hold a press conference, Zia Yusuf turns up after everybody's left, and then the government races to respond. So next thing, Andy Burnham is down in Dover talking about the boats, saying that he's going to be relentless. And what have we done? Again, we've allowed Reform to set the table. We've allowed Reform to set the agenda. 2 weeks ago, right, everybody was talking about, oh, Nigel Farage is going up against a bin. Right now we're talking about the small boats again. And it comes back to this thing of like, you know, when Starmer was in power, we always used to talk about how bad they were at politics. And we always used to say that they were in this bind where they were losing votes to Reform and they were losing votes to the Greens, and how difficult that was, because how do you appeal to the left? How do you try and appeal to the people who've gone to Reform because of immigration? It's actually a genuinely difficult position to be in. But then we saw, as the 2 years progressed, that Labour were losing more votes to the Greens than they were to Reform. And I had sort of thought all along that this sort of tactic of trying to be as Reform was never a smart tactic. I still think that. I think that about the Tories too. I think what the two main parties, or the previous main parties, the two traditional parties of government, I think they need to plant their feet and take a position. And when Burnham first came in, I thought it was so smart that he focused on the cost of living. So smart. You know, to roll out these policies. Now, I said twice on the show in the last couple of weeks that I was suspicious. I'm suspicious of a centrist government. I'm suspicious of this Labour cabinet. But did I think that those three policies were good policies? Yes, I thought they were good policies, and they captured the imagination. And we have the Burnham bounce. And again, I'm not saying that, you know, that masses of people are going to turn against Burnham because he turned up in Dover today. But it sends a very mixed message. And I think it for me, it suggests that maybe the strategy of this Labour government is not as clear-cut as we might have thought. Okay, now that I've got that off my chest, should I talk about Australia?
Feel free.
So the question is whether those deaths, drownings that absolutely did go down, you know, the stats are there, the stats prove it. The question is whether the only way for that to happen was for Australia to introduce probably the most draconian anti-immigration, anti-asylum policies that have been introduced by any country for decades. You touched on how...
I suppose, just, I'm sorry to interrupt so early, but in terms of, it's anti-irregular asylum, because in terms of in terms of resettlement, they've got one of the most progressive policies in the world.
They have now.
So it's not a blanket anti-asylum policy, it's anti-irregular migration policy, so that they can then have quite a progressive regular migration policy.
Except that there's something called the Refugee Convention that they're signed up to, that the UK is signed up to. And actually the UK helped to write. And that says that when somebody presents, you have to put them through an asylum process. You know, that's what that says. So you can't sort of... And by the way, when Australia was pursuing these draconian policies, it violated the Refugee Convention day in, day out. And so, yeah, sure. I mean, you can call it irregular, but it's still people presenting at the border and claiming asylum. Now, you don't want them to do it in a risky way. I don't want people crossing the channel and drowning in the channel. I don't think that that's a way that people should have to claim asylum. And that's why, of course, I support also this notion of safe routes. But it's not like what Australia did was introduce safe routes methodically and smartly, and then that reduced in a humanitarian way the number of people who felt they were forced to go by sea. What Australia did was Australia treated people appallingly. It violated people's rights. It put them in what it called detention centres. But I think by any stretch of the imagination, if you look at what those quote-unquote detention centres actually were, they were concentration camps. Nauru, I'm sorry, I can't remember the other one, but they were Papua New Guinea territories. People didn't have enough food. People didn't have enough medicine. People were not treated for mental health issues. People killed themselves. People went on hunger strike. You know, at one point there was a statistic that showed that I think it was 75 to 80 out of every 1,000 people detained was on hunger strike. We're not talking 2, 10, 20 hunger strikes. We're talking hundreds and hundreds of hunger strikes. So again, the question becomes, was all that necessary in order to get to a place where you can say that you're allowing people to come in via safe routes? And then when we talk about the UK, you know, what does safe routes actually mean? Right? That's another thing that sort of bugs me about this conversation, is when you see the government come out and say, well, we're going to stop the small boats by introducing, you know, if they're not reformed, talking about how we're going to go and we're going to blow them out of the water with the Navy. If you have a government that's saying what we're going to do is introduce safe routes, what does that mean and how realistic is that? And what I would want to see is the government come out and outline exactly what they mean by safe routes. Because you had talked about working with the UN Refugee Agency, which is one way. But just before I come to the UN Refugee Agency, one other way is obviously that you arrive on a plane, you know, or you arrive on a ferry, and then you get here and you claim asylum. Because under UK law, you have to present in person. You know, you can't claim asylum unless you present in person in this country. Now, most people in war zones, they can't just get in a plane and come here, right? The airport might be destroyed. They might not have a passport. They might not have the money to travel. They might not have a visa, because that's the other key thing. To come here on a plane or a ferry and claim asylum, you would have to have a visa to come here. And you know, there's an index that shows you the most powerful passports in the world and the least powerful passports in the world, right? Based on how many countries you can travel to. All of the least powerful passports in the world belong to, I have them, Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Pakistan. Look, all countries where people would ordinarily be granted asylum. So the UK doesn't have an asylum visa. It doesn't have any sort of humanitarian visa where people can come that way. Then you look at the UNHCR thing. Now, that is a viable thing that you can do. You can go to the UN Refugee Agency and you can say, okay, we're willing to take 15,000 refugees, 20,000 refugees, or whatever it is a year. Now, I've been to refugee camps in a lot of different parts of the world. I've been to refugee camps in Somalia, in Eritrea, in Sudan, in Ethiopia. And what I often found in those camps were tens and tens of thousands of people who wanted that. right? They were looking to get in a UNHCR process where then they would be taken on safe route by another country. By the way, quite a lot of them wanted to go to Canada, and your stat bears out why they wanted to go there. But a teeny amount ever get there. And, you know, always remember this camp I was in Eritrea where people had been there 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years. And here's the incredible stat. About 1% of people in UNHCR refugee camps can ever expect to be resettled to a third country via safe routes. So, you know, just one more point on the UK. Who comes in here via safe routes as well? It's Ukrainians, right, who have safe passage at the moment. And then there was Afghans who had worked with UK military forces. Just a little aside, that shows me that those decisions can also be political. As in, you know, we're going to take people in by safe routes, but we're going to take Ukrainians, political incentive to do that, and Afghans who work for our military, political incentive to do that. It's just, I don't trust that the safe routes will be introduced in the right way. I don't trust that they will have a significant impact. And I would want to see them tested before any draconian measures are introduced in the channel.
Yes, I suppose I think how I would respond is that, one, I mean, you're saying that these safe routes, not many people go on them at the moment. And I think that's terrible, right? I think many more people should go on them. But I think the only way you're going to get the political buy-in to take more people via those routes is if you can show that you've controlled migration by other means. And I think that's sort of borne out in the fact that the countries that accept lots of people from these routes are countries like Australia and Canada, which don't have much irregular migration. Whereas sort of Germany, France, they're not taking so many people because they've already got a huge migration debate surrounding the people who turn up on their doorstep. I also think I think there is something about the Refugee Convention that has become quite dishonest at the moment, because it means that if you arrive in you've got all of these European countries that say, don't come here, don't come here, don't come here, don't come here. However, if you get there and you're from Sudan or you're from a country where you're going to very likely get asylum, you will get asylum if you arrive there. So you're telling people, don't come here, don't come here. And then you make the journey as dangerous as possible. So the Europeans are literally paying off the Libyans, paying off the Tunisians. You've got people in, you know, talk about concentration camps in Nauru. I mean, they were much worse in Libya because you've got an authoritarian government who's rounding up sub-Saharan African people and putting them in a detention center, all funded by the Europeans. And there is no liberal government in Europe who is saying this should stop happening because they know that their politics can't handle these people arriving in their country. So we have this sort of hands-off, dishonest thing where if you manage to land in our country, oh, we believe in rights, but we're going to do everything to try and trip you up along the way, and you might well die along the way. And I think there's something a bit more honest about saying, okay, this whole sort of trial of hardship that we're forcing you to go on, that's actually a dead end. This movement across borders, it isn't working. If you do that, you can't stay, but we are going to take loads of people from refugee camps. If you want to come here, that's the way. And at the moment, you said the selection mechanism might not be, you know, it might be impacted by politics. I mean, at the moment, it's impacted by who's willing to take the biggest risks. So I think one big reason why asylum policy in this country, it's difficult to get support for it, is because the way we do this, you have to be able to travel across continents and go through extreme risks, is it's mainly going to be young men. And if everyone arriving is a young man, it is much harder to win political consent for this than if you've got families arriving. And precisely what you can do if you're going straight to a refugee camp and picking out people is you get families, you get whole families, and you can have a plan as to how to integrate them. So I just think that is, and by the way, if someone says, why can't you have both? If you have the safe routes, people will stop traveling. Well, unless when you're giving out your safe routes, you pick out particularly young men who might be able to afford to come here, right? You're not going to be giving asylum to the same people as the people who will be inclined to travel. So I think when people say safe routes will stop the illegal crossing, that only works if you give asylum to millions of people so that you cover everyone who might otherwise come.
But the reason young men travel is because they're the ones who can take the risks. They're the ones who can undertake the arduous journey, as you said. And then we know that why they come, they're going to then bring their families. They're going to hope for family reunification. If they were coming in through safe routes, there's no reason why it should only be men who would come, right? Families could come, women could come.
That's my point,
children could come, yeah. But I think maybe where we're differing here is you seem to be saying make the journey impossible and then introduce the safe routes.
We do them at exactly the same time. I mean,
I think what I'm saying is introduce the safe routes to disincentivize the journey.
but
And I know you're not arguing this, but what I'm saying is introduce the safe routes to disincentivize the journey, not abuse the human rights of people who are traveling anywhere for asylum. You know, when I talk about countries that are signed up to the Refugee Convention, the other thing is that everybody in this world has that right to claim asylum. So, you know, when somebody arrives in Dover or Calais, whatever, when they claim asylum, they're exercising a right. They're exercising a right that countries have agreed to. And they're exercising a right that the UK government is supposed to uphold and also, again, drafted. So does the UK government want to withdraw from the Refugee Convention? I mean, I guess it could, but I don't know that you would advocate
well,
for
Australia
that.
didn't, but they definitely didn't.
But they got away with
the
it,
law.
yeah.
But I think if you would,
sorry, just one point
if you
on
were to
that.
design a refugee system from scratch, would it look like the current one we have, which is rich countries pay loads and loads of money to try and stop people arriving, but if they manage to survive all the risks, the torture, the torment, then they can probably stay. I mean, because obviously it does just give a massive incentive for loads of people to risk their lives.
Well, the story that you're talking there about Libya and Tunisia, that is a disgrace. That needs so much more coverage. Like the European Union is bribing, effectively, or paying off a dictator in Tunisia to push people back from his border. Sometimes they're dumped in the desert.
But there isn't
in
a
Tunisia.
single government in Europe, right wing, left wing, centre left, who is against that policy because they all know that their politics can't survive
it's
these people arriving.
poison. But yeah, it's political poison. But sorry, I had a question.
So we can wish for a different world where sort of actually people were really just happy to have millions of people
But so
arrive.
you
and then
believe
we
that
wouldn't-
if they stopped the illegal crossings, you then fully believe that the UK would introduce a humane, safe route policy?
I mean, I think if Labour do it, yes. If Reform do it, no.
Imagine,
Obviously not.
but you're talking about how it's political poison, and we have Burnham down there on the.
I mean, and Australia is the example of a country that did literally this.
I think it's because well, right, but people died, people committed suicide, people went on hunger strike. You know, there are contentions that it caused modern slavery.
But this all happens in Libya times 20.
But so what?
Because
Why should that happen here?
By not having because those are the options, I think. The options are, I mean, and this is what the Europeans have decided. The options are, we have the status quo, which involves paying Libyans to stop. Because European politicians don't think their publics will consent to the number of people crossing who would want to cross freely and who might be entitled to asylum. So they pay Libyan dictators and the Tunisians to put people in prisons. Now, you can say, OK, actually, the European politicians should make an argument that these hundreds of thousands of people should be able to come to Britain. Not a single European government is against this. So it does seem to me that there is a bit of it's this or that.
But so we're talking about the politics of it, right? You're talking about political incentives here, which are, absolutely are very strong. And, I think that's why we saw 22 of 27 member states out of the gate to slam Spain over what happened in Ceuta, even though I would contend it's not Spain's fault, but we'll come to that later. But so are you saying that do you believe that if the small boats crossings stop, that the British public will then accept policies being introduced to open safe routes? As in, say all the crossings stop, or say the crossings dwindle to a tiny, tiny number. Do you think then that the British government would have support to introduce, say, like an asylum visa or a humanitarian visa? You think that the public would support
I don't see why not.
that?
I mean, that's what happened in Australia. I mean, migration was just as toxic in Australia, if not more than it is here, when they had the small boats arriving. They got rid of the small boats, and now they have 25. They have the second highest number of safe routes in the world, and migration is not a salient issue.
Okay,
or asylum's not a salient issue.
My final question.
Go on.
Because we're pushed for time. This should be down the pub, I feel.
Well, also, I like that you're questioning me. This is good.
How would you do it?
Well, I mean, that's the $1 million. As I said, ideally,
How would you stop the crossings?
So ideally, what you'd have
at the same time as introducing the safe.
Ideally, what you'd have is a deal with each of those countries to say they go back, but it's not going to be easy. But what I'm saying is, I think
it's not that it's not going to be easy. It's never going to happen.
No, but there's two issues: is this desirable, and then how do you do it? And I think it's desirable. I think the question of how you do it is an open one. I mean, I think the Channel one would be, if you just make a deal with France, you can do that.
I want to say something before we end, and I know this is not aimed at you, but you know, I feel like a lot of the time when we discuss this issue and when it's debated and when it's in the media, it's always about what's politically expedient, right?
Well,
Especially like Westminster types always get into this. Well, you know, what would be clever is if Labour did this, but you know, actually, there's also a moral point here. You know, there's also like, how do you want your country to stand in a clear-eyed, moral way and abide by its international obligations and uphold the rights of people fleeing from war to claim asylum in the country? Because ultimately, that's the thing. Like, the right would also want you to believe that we're dealing with sort of quote-unquote economic migrants all the time. But no, we're dealing with people who are fleeing wars that, and this is a point that's made ad nauseum on the left, wars that we have contributed to ourselves. We have contributed to destabilizing those countries. And I don't want to be some sort of naive like Robin. No, I don't think Robin Cook was naive. I think he was righteous. But when Robin Cook talked about Britain having an ethical foreign policy, he was almost laughed out of Parliament. You know, the media made out he was some kind of naive innocent. And I guess I could come across that way making this argument. But Jesus, do we not want to do what's right anymore?
But what would be right? So this is where I also think the current liberal consensus is a little bit dishonest, because, I mean, there are potentially hundreds of millions of people who might be able to get asylum in Europe and would want to come where it's easy. Like, the fact that it's really difficult to get there is already filtering out so many people. Like, if you make that trip less deadly, if you stop paying the Libyans, if you stop paying the Tunisians, so many more people will come. And I do think that it is not just about political expediency, that there is going to be some way of rationing those places.
You can't take in the whole world.
So if you're not taking in the whole world,
that,
then you're going to have some method of saying, no, you can't come here, you can come here. And at the moment, our method of you can come here, you can't come here is, do you survive the dangerous crossing? And I think that a better method of saying you can come here, you can't come here would be, I mean, maybe some kind of lottery system on a refugee camp.
A lottery system?
Well, whatever kind of system. I mean, that's how green cards work with the United States, isn't it?
That's true, but yeah. But I mean, look, safe routes, yes. Fast decisions. That's another thing. You know, that like the asylum system here is clogged. It's completely clogged. Decisions take too long, and you know, people end up staying in hotels, much to the chagrin of the right. And I know, you know, me and you talked about this off air. You know, about how much it costs to put people up in hotels. It's not nothing, but you know, when you look at the policies, I mean, I know you're not arguing that we should introduce the exact same draconian policies that Australia. I hope you're not. I know you're not. But that cost a lot more.
Yeah, but
that cost a fortune.
But then it solves the problem for a decade.
Like, if you want to talk about material impact on the country.
Myanmar's imprisoned Aung San Suu Kyi, a one-time pro-democracy icon and winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, was seen in photographs for the first time in years today. Now, with Myanmar currently in the grip of an intense civil war, this wasn't really something that anyone saw coming. And that has raised questions about why the country's military rulers would choose to release images of Aung San Suu Kyi now. So here are the photos. They were released by the junta in the first two. You can see Suu Kyi meeting with Arnaud de Bac, who is the International Committee of the Red Cross's representative to Myanmar. And then she is pictured cutting what appears to be a birthday cake. Suu Kyi's age here is not irrelevant. She's now 81 years old. And her appearance in these photos comes after years of concerns about what has been reported as her deteriorating health. Suu Kyi campaigned for democracy in Myanmar from the 1980s onwards. She spent over a decade under house arrest. That's when she became a sort of international pro-democracy icon. Her party then won a landslide in elections in 2015. However, that I'm sure you're aware, her reputation was tarnished by her support for the ethnic cleansing of Rohingya Muslims. She was later, not really relatedly, but later she was overthrown by a military coup in 2021. That coup was followed by massive public protests, which were put down brutally by the military, and a civil war broke out quickly after that. The map of who currently controls what in Myanmar is insanely complicated. This is from Al Jazeera. It shows areas from those fully controlled by the military and those fully controlled by resistance groups. Most other parts of the country fall somewhere in between. And the image of Suu Kyi is so significant because before this, apart from a letter to one of her sons 2.5 years ago, there had been no proof even of her life. So her son, Kim Aris, who is a British citizen, has today reacted to those photographs. Here he is speaking to Reuters.
I can confirm the meeting did take place, and my mother does appear to be in good health, but they didn't have a physician of their own present, so they weren't able to examine her themselves. But by all appearances, she seems okay. Well, it's the first independent proof that I've had that she's actually alive for a long time now, so it's extremely meaningful. But I can only hope that this is just a step forwards to her actually being free, because she was incarcerated under trumped-up charges in the first place and should never have been in prison. And I know that the military want to say that the situation in Burma is normalised now, but it's far from that. And until she is free, and along with all the other political prisoners, that just won't be the case. Well, I know the Red Cross will hope to maintain this line of communication with the military now and with my mother. And hopefully through that, I can also get a line of communication to her. These things can take time to develop, but I'm hoping that eventually I will be allowed to speak with her directly. I'm still hesitant. After all, the military have been playing their games for so many years, and this is just another move on their part to try and gain more legitimacy, as far as I can see. They're not doing it for her human rights or anything of the like. So until she's freed, then I have to be cautious with my optimism.
Barry, I know you've been following this conflict more closely than I have. What are the significance of these images being released today?
I do think it's significant. And I don't think anyone expected it. I think it's come sort of out of the blue. And it does say something potentially interesting about where the military junta in Myanmar is in terms of how it thinks the war is going and what it thinks is the best route to its survival, actually. You know, I think you said in the intro there, I mean, Myanmar spent decades under military rule, and Aung San Suu Kyi became this democracy icon. Everybody will remember what a massive global figure she was and how feted she was around the world, you know, coming out on stage at Bono concerts, U2 concerts. I don't know that Bono was solo, but you know what I mean? She was like feted by the great and the good politicians and celebrities. And then you were absolutely right to say that reputation was tarnished somewhat by what happened to the mostly Muslim Rohingya minority in Myanmar, who it was more than ethnic cleansing. You know, it was, I mean, I think a lot of people have concluded it was genocide. I certainly think it has all the hallmarks of genocide. There are now 1.3 million Rohingya people living in Bangladesh who are forced out of Myanmar. 1.3 million people forced over the border. And she pretty much defended that. You know, I think her apologists sort of say, well, she was probably under pressure from the military. I don't know. She defended it. But what's clear is that the people of Myanmar wanted her as president, very, very much wanted her as president. Because when she first ran as they were sort of trying to liberalize a little bit the junta, I think it was 2015, 2016 was this election. She had like an absolute landslide victory. I think 80% of seats in parliament. Even the military rulers at the time, I think some of them acknowledged the people of Myanmar clearly want Aung San Suu Kyi to be president. But they had this really weird thing in the constitution. And the constitution wasn't written that long before this all happened. And it was written by the military. And essentially it barred any person from Myanmar who had a foreign husband, right, which she does because her husband is British, had a foreign child. She has 2 children, they're British citizens. And this is how crazy it was. You couldn't run for president, or you couldn't be president if even one of your children was married to a foreigner, right? So people thought, they said, well, it's to protect our sovereignty. But most people thought, nah, it's to make sure that Aung San Suu Kyi can't be president.
Can't be president if you have 4 names.
Yeah, exactly. That would be, they should have done that. And so she became, I think, what was called a state councillor, but somebody from the military remained as president. Now, she was the de facto leader and she had a lot of power. And I think she was seeking to like extend that power. And she was pushing quite a lot against the military. But they were always there, always in the background. There was always that threat. And then they had another election in 2021. Again, a democratic election. You know, in a country that had been under military rule for decades, it is widely recognized as being a democratic election. And again, the party of Aung San Suu Kyi wins in a massive landslide. I think that was January 2021. They were toppled in February 2021. The military massively miscalculated, though, because I think that the military thought, okay, you know, I don't think they liked the space that she was carving out and the space that essentially civilian politicians were carving out. And I think that they thought that their influence would be reduced. And so they decided, you know what, this is more trouble than it's worth. We'll just take back over. And they thought that they could put down opposition. They were so wrong. And again, I think tying into what I was talking about, how the people of Myanmar clearly wanted her to be their leader in massive numbers. And so they took to the streets in massive numbers. And the military cracked down really, really brutally. And they were killing protesters, but also they rounded up so many people. They rounded up tens and tens of thousands of people, a lot of them young people. And again, massive miscalculation because civilians got together and they started these, like, they were called like people's support groups, or they were essentially like civilian kind of militias almost that started up. And then all of these sort of ethnic-based armed groups who had been around for a long time, they all joined in. And so now that the entire country is engulfed in a war, and the army is really, really, really struggling. You know, there are estimates that they may only control about 20%, fully control about 20% of territory in the country. Then other bits are fully controlled by different armed groups, and then other bits are contested. But, you know, when a government only controls 20% of the country, and then that government is in serious trouble. I think that they've calculated that before they didn't want to remind people of Aung San Suu Kyi because they were thinking about that constituency of people who came out and protested in the streets. They were thinking about that constituency of people who started the sort of civilian militias. Now they clearly think that the bigger threat is the ethnic-based militias. So there is a coalition of militias in the north who are really powerful. Then actually where you had the Rohingya, where the Rohingya came from, Rakhine State, there's a big militia there called the Arakan Army. By the way, they've also been committing atrocities against the Rohingya who remain in the country. Anyway, so essentially what I think is they've decided this is a bigger threat than this. And so in putting Aung San Suu Kyi out there and saying, well, we're treating her well, she's not dying, we gave her a birthday cake, I think that they're hoping to mend relations with regional countries, especially the countries of the Asian regional bloc who expelled them. Actually, quite rare for Asian to bare its teeth, but it did bare its teeth here and kick Myanmar out. They have China, they have Russia, but China is always playing a kind of a two-sided game with them a little bit. And so I think that they want to mend relations with regional countries because I think that they potentially see that as the way out. And they're trying to present themselves as a reasonable government a reasonable government who you should back instead of these rebel groups, because I think that they've decided that they can't beat them. So that they're now a bigger threat than Aung San Suu Kyi.
And what's gone so wrong in, obviously this is a massive question, so you answer it however you want. But like Myanmar is in a region that has quite a lot of, positive stories in it, like Thailand, basically a middle-income country. Bangladesh, still very poor, but it's had massive growth. I mean, it does have political instability now, but over the past few decades, it's been sort of, when people talk about where's a development good news story, they might point to Bangladesh. Obviously, Vietnam in the region, phenomenal. Myanmar still, I was looking it up today, it's still £6,000 a year per capita, or dollars, sorry, $6,000 per year per capita GDP. It's not enjoying the same sort of levels of development that its neighbours are. Did they just get unlucky with this junta that cares more about staying in power than development in the country? It just seems like, why has it not been lifted by any of these tides around it?
Yeah, that's how I see it. I think that they had a military junta that was massively corrupt. And like most militaries who control a country, they become a massive racket. They control all kinds of businesses, and they're only about lining their own pockets. And so everybody else is left to their own devices. And also, there were ethnicities in other parts of the country, I think particularly around the north and Rakhine, who were left behind, you know? And so those regions became incredibly poor, or remained incredibly poor, because of massive corruption around the army. I think that's a huge part of it.
Last week's surge of migrants arriving in Ceuta has shaken European politics. But what actually happened? Well, we know the story from the far right.
I'm here in Ceuta, the Spanish territory that was just stormed by 50,000 Moroccan men in that extraordinary footage. Now, we also saw some of those men maraud through town overnight. We saw them loot shops, we saw them terrorize locals. We heard from a man who said he's wanted for murder in his home country. But here's the thing, when you see 50,000 arrive in a single day, what happens? Spain sends its armed forces in response. 200,000 have turned up on British beaches illegally under Tory and Labour.
So that was Reform's Zia Youssef, whose attempt at hard-hitting investigative reporting live from Ceuta included a bunch of unverified footage. I think some of it from riots that took place a couple of years ago. Claims about looting which haven't been reported anywhere else. So slop, really. And the fact that migrants, or the Moroccans had all been sent back to Morocco by the time Zia Youssef got there, somewhat undermined this comment from another leading Reform politician. So Suella Braverman, on the day the barriers were first breached, tweeted a video with the caption, "Make no mistake, these men are on their way to the UK right now." The men in that video will almost certainly not be on their way to the UK. Over 48,000 of the roughly 50,000 people who entered the exclave have now been returned. So this was in reality an immigration crisis, or so-called immigration crisis, that had no material effect on any country in mainland Europe, let alone the UK. But the scenes from Ceuta were undeniably striking. And actually, we can call them a crisis because they left at least 72 Moroccans dead. Their aftermath has come with speculation as to what exactly this was all about, what was going on. Some, of course, have looked to geopolitics. For example, could this have been a crisis engineered by Morocco in protest at a recent official Spanish visit to their rival neighbour, Algeria? Well, comments from a Moroccan man speaking to the New York Times could support that theory. So 24-year-old Ajoub El Arot told the New York Times this: "I don't know why they let us through. Maybe they had some political reason. They opened the border and let everyone go by. When there are political problems, Morocco opens the door and tells us to go." Spain, which never misses an opportunity to lecture Israel, has declared a state of emergency in Ceuta following the crisis over its immigration policy. Maybe before it continues lecturing us, it's time it explained to the world why it still maintains colonial enclaves in Africa. To be honest, there is a genuine question, why do they have enclaves in Africa? But we'll assume, I'm not going to give Danny Danon credit for that fairly obvious point. Many European leaders have also suggested that Spain brought this on themselves. So Italy and Denmark put forward a letter to the EU that was signed by 22 out of 27 member states. Here's an extract. They said, "We are writing to express our serious concern regarding the recent developments at the external border of the European Union in Ceuta. We are determined to prevent smugglers from challenging the integrity of the Union's external borders. We recognise that the recent ruling of the Spanish Supreme Court has been used to trigger this attack and abuse our migration and asylum system. At the same time, we have a duty to effectively deter and relentlessly combat illegal migration by coordinating our action, strengthening our external borders, and addressing all policies that can serve as pull factors, such as the regularisation of very large numbers of irregular migrants." So what they're referring to there is a Spanish Supreme Court ruling in June that said authorities in Ceuta could not immediately deport people who arrive by sea without due process. So suggesting that sort of encouraged lots of people to cross over. They're also sort of alluding to Spain's recent amnesty for undocumented migrants. They suggest that could have been a pull factor for people trying to get into Spain. That's a narrative that Pedro Sanchez has pushed back against in a letter to European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. He said that Spain, in fact, has one of the least porous of Europe's external borders, and he complained about a lack of solidarity from some European peers. So he said this: most have shown us their support and solidarity and have offered their assistance. Others, however, have chosen to attack Spain and to call for its temporary exclusion from the Schengen area. In the current international context, the European Union cannot afford this kind of selfish, polarising and unlawful reaction. Barry, been lots of sort of long reads about this over the weekend. And the NYT had an interesting one, the FT had an interesting one, sort of saying, why did this happen and why now? Obviously, something happened because 50,000 people came on the same day. So there must have been something that motivated them to do that. What's your best read on what went on late last week?
Well, it's clearly not as simple as the likes of Reform and the right across the continent are making out. It wasn't, look, 60,000 people didn't all just get together on the same day and decide to, quote unquote, invade Europe. You know, also 60,000 people didn't manage to get out of Morocco without the Moroccan authorities turning some kind of a blind eye. I think that there is very convincing reporting that they at least let it happen, that they at least didn't stop it happening. Whether they orchestrated it, I mean, that's another question, but they certainly allowed it to happen. And Morocco has a long history of this. You know, this is not new. We know this. We know that Morocco has used its own people and its border with Ceuta to put diplomatic pressure, not only on Spain, but on other European countries in the past. A lot of it comes down to Western Sahara. I do think it's worth talking about Western Sahara briefly, especially because of the accusations that Israel somehow pulled the strings. I don't think Israel pulled the strings at all. But Israel is not a part of this story in a way. Because the last time that a huge number of people tried to get into Ceuta from Morocco was, I think, 2008, when Spain had a visit from the leader of the Polisario Front, right? So the Novara audience are very clever and will probably know this, but I'll just in case.
I don't know what the Polisario Front is, so unless they're a lot smarter than me, which they probably are.
I'll try to do it very quickly. Western Sahara, which borders Morocco, is, I believe, the last true colony on the face of the planet. There are other countries, right? I think there are 17. The UN has this thing called like a non-self-governing territories list. And they believe that sort of the process of decolonization in the world has not been completed until these 17 non-self-governing territories become self-governing. But most of them have some measure of autonomy. Western Sahara has no measure of autonomy, no control over its own affairs, is not recognized in any way, shape, or form as a nation state or a people, and they have never had the right to self-determination. So essentially, it was a territory called Spanish Sahara. It was Spanish colonial territory that they withdrew from in 1976. When they withdrew in 1976, Morocco and Mauritania started to fight over it. Finally, Mauritania gave up, and Morocco annexed it, and nearly the vast majority of the people, who are called the Sahrawi people, fled into Algeria. So now you have more Western Saharan Sahrawi people living in refugee camps in Algeria than live in the territory itself. And that's been the case for decades. The Polisario Front is the rebel group. It's the rebel group in Western Sahara that wants to set up a state. Now, the leader of the Polisario Front, I believe, visited Spain in 2008. And then shortly afterwards, 8,000 Moroccans stormed the Ceuta. Right? So this is an established thing that has happened before. I think what's really interesting background is that in the last year, I wrote about this in my newsletter, Proximities. In the last year, Morocco has been making big moves, finally, in terms of consolidating its control over Western Sahara. And where Israel does come into the story is that what Morocco has been trying to do is to have people recognize a plan that it has for Western Sahara. The plan is to give the people in Western Sahara, Polisario, you know, officials in Western Sahara, some small measure of autonomy. So they will have control over sort of like some local affairs, judiciary, stuff like that. Whereas Morocco will still control, you know, budget, foreign policy, yada, yada.
Resources, maybe.
Yeah, well, exactly. And there are resources. Now, most countries in the world have not recognized Morocco's claim. But in the last few years, more and more and more have started to recognize it. And some of that has come at the behest of Donald Trump. Because in 2020, Trump recognized Morocco's claim, thought it was the best plan, said it was the best plan for the region. In exchange for what? In exchange for Morocco signing up to the Abraham Accords. So in exchange for Morocco normalizing relations with Israel. And so Morocco has realized that it's realized that it's moving in the right direction when it comes to Western Sahara. I think at some point, at a height, about 83 countries recognized what's called the potential state in Western Sahara. It's called SADR. 83 countries recognized that actually the Polisario Front as the government of Western Sahara. It's less than 50 now. They're dropping like flies. And a lot of them are dropping off because of pressure from the US. So I don't see it as Israel applying pressure to Morocco. I see it as Morocco playing a super smart game, playing Trump, playing the Israelis, playing the Europeans. And so when I look at this and I look at the reporting, again, you know, I'm trying to look at what good news agencies are reporting, good analysts are saying. It looks very much like this might have been pressure on Spain around Western Sahara.
I mean, it is. And so if it was concocted by the Moroccan government, it did leave 72 of their citizens dead. So
which is the big point here, isn't it? That like the Moroccans essentially sacrificed 72 young people to prove a point. And it's not the first time they've done it. And that route is one of the most dangerous routes in the world, migration routes. Loads of people drown trying to get around that route. You know, there's people who go every year. You know, it's not like 8,000 people or 60,000 people, but there is a constant sort of flow of people trying to get to Ceuta, not only from Morocco. A lot of them come from sub-Saharan Africa. You know, a lot of them are trafficked up there as well. You know, so yeah, the Moroccan government knows quite well how treacherous that is. And if it did sort of say, you know, then that is, I mean, it's just unforgivable, isn't it? To sacrifice your own young people to prove a diplomatic point.
Yeah, I'm also not sure what point it proved, because, I mean, I suppose, is it a warning shot to Spain, basically?
Yeah, saying we can do this anytime we want.
Anytime. That makes sense. Barry, very enlightening today.
I've
learned a lot. The Myanmar stuff, the Western Sahara stuff, is very impressive.
We have to finish our other conversation like down the bar now, right?
Potentially, we can do.
Okay.
Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.